They wheeled her into the operating room just after midnight. She was pale, weak, the once flawless woman who left me behind like a forgotten suitcase, now fighting for her life. I watched through the glass as my team prepared the neural interface I'd spent half my life building, the last hope for reversing the damage in her brain. They didn't know who she was to me, just another patient. But I knew. I recognized the lines around her mouth. The same mouth that once told me I was too broken to be her daughter. And now, she was about to live because of me. She didn't see me when she woke up, not at first. She asked the nurse who made this miracle machine. I stepped forward. Her face changed. Recognition, regret, fear. But I didn't flinch. You abandoned me in a wheelchair. I gave you back your legs. So tell me if the person who discarded you needed your mercy. Would you give it? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories like this on HP. Family drama. I was born in late autumn. Seattle rain fell like it always does, quiet, steady cold. My mother didn't hold me. They said she barely looked at me. The nurses tried to dress it up. They told me later in hushed tones, some mothers just take longer to bond. But the truth was simpler. She saw the chair before she saw the child. I had a rare congenital disorder. My legs would never work the way hers did. And in a house like hers, a home of tailored curtains, crystal glasses, and curated brunches, disability didn't fit. I grew up in the corners of that world. When guests came, I stayed upstairs. When photos were taken, I wasn't in them. My mother, Linda, never yelled, never hit. She just erased me gently. She spoke to me with a smile, but always from across the room, like love was a service she outsourced. By the time I was 9, I knew the rules: be quiet, be polite, be invisible. And then the rule changed. She met him, Jonathan. A man with a country club smile and a name that opened doors. He was rich, charming, powerful, and he didn't know she had a disabled daughter. I remember the day she packed my suitcase. She didn't cry. She folded my clothes like she was sending me off to camp. "You'll be happier there," she said. "More people like you." There was a care facility 4 states away, small, underfunded, and filled with echoes, the kind of place where the walls were more familiar than people. I was 10. No birthday cards came, no visits, just one payment confirmation each quarter signed by Linda as if that proved she still remembered. I was angry. But more than that, I was numb. It was a nurse named Helen who changed things. She was in her 60s, stern, but kind. She gave me a hand-me-down laptop and said, "You can't fix the past, but maybe you can build something new." I clung to that machine like a lifeline. I taught myself coding, algorithms, neural theory, not because I had some big dream, but because I needed something, anything that made me feel less powerless. Years passed. I graduated with a full scholarship, earned my PhD in biomedical engineering by 32, started my own lab. Quiet, anonymous. I kept my name off publications when I could. I didn't want the world to know who I was. I just wanted to build what I never had control. My work focused on the brain, on restoring function where the body had given up. I created prototypes of a neural interface that could bridge damaged pathways. Nothing fancy, nothing flashy, but it worked. And I stayed hidden. Until one morning, I received a file from a hospital in Portland. A patient with late-stage neurodegeneration, rapid decline. Unresponsive to conventional treatment, they asked for experimental intervention. I almost declined. Then I saw the name Linda M. Chastain. My mother. 40 years after she sent me away, her life, her mind was slipping. And the only technology that could save her came from the daughter she discarded. My hands trembled, but not from fear. From something deeper. A quiet question pressing itself against every bone in my body. Do I save the woman who didn't save me? Do I give her back a life she never wanted to share? I didn't answer right away, but I didn't close the file either, because deep down I knew this wasn't about her anymore. It was about who I had become when no one was watching. I didn't say yes immediately. I let the file sit on my desk for 2 days. During that time, I reread every sentence of the medical summary twice. Linda was deteriorating quickly. Her speech was fragmented, her motor skills were collapsing, her neural imaging showed severe synaptic degradation. Every line was a countdown. They were losing her. But I'd already lost her decades ago. There was no call, no letter, no sign she even remembered I was still alive. Still, the request kept staring at me. It wasn't from her. It came from a doctor named Patel, neurologist at a private hospital in Portland. He'd found my team's most recent publication on signal restoration via multipathway neural scaffolding. He wrote with urgency, but also reverence. He didn't know who I was to her, just a scientist with something that might work. He signed the email with the words, "She has no one else left." I remember sitting at the edge of my bed that night, staring into the dark, asking myself a question that didn't come with an easy answer. Would helping her make me weak or worse? Would it make me just like her, desperate to preserve appearances no matter the cost? The next morning, I opened my laptop and replied, "Yes, I'll take the case. I want full oversight." They granted it. Within 48 hours, my team had the patient transferred into our care. Everything was by the book, anonymous intake, private floor, strict NDAs. No one on my staff knew who she really was. They didn't recognize her. She looked nothing like the woman I remembered. The polished, perfectly poised socialite had been replaced by someone gaunt, hollowed by time and illness. I watched her through the one-way observation window. She was strapped into the stabilization cradle as we prepared the interface calibration. Her hands trembled constantly, eyes flicking back and forth as if still searching for control. I wondered if she remembered what it felt like to control a room, to control a story, to control me. She was silent, disconnected. Not just from her body, but from the version of herself she'd built all her life. And now it was my design that would decide whether she regained anything at all. Before the procedure, my lead engineer asked me if I wanted to do the honors. I nodded. I rolled into the chamber myself, no announcement, no flourish, just a quiet presence beside the woman who once erased me. She didn't notice. I guided the electrode arms into place with steady hands, my hands, and then we began. The procedure lasted 4 hours. It went clean, no interruptions, no neural shock. The interface fused properly. Linda remained unconscious for another 16. When she finally stirred, I wasn't in the room, but the team told me what she said first. Where am I? Then what happened to me? And finally, who made this machine? It wasn't until day 3 of her recovery that she asked to meet the lead scientist. I debated saying no, but something inside me whispered, "It's time." When I entered the room, she was sitting up half-dressed in a hospital gown, hair thinned and face drawn. She looked at me, and then looked again. Her eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but recognition. She blinked slowly. Her voice came out cracked and uncertain. "Sarah," I didn't answer. I only looked at her the way I wished she had once looked at me. She began to cry. And even then I wasn't sure if they were tears of regret, shame, or simply disbelief. She reached for my hand. I didn't move. "You saved me," she whispered. "After everything No," I said, voice steady. "I saved a patient." She broke. Right there in that sterile room surrounded by technology she couldn't name and a daughter she'd abandoned, Linda Chastain broke. She begged. For forgiveness. For understanding. For something that could rewrite 40 years of silence. But I didn't offer closure, because I hadn't come for hers. I'd come to reclaim mine. "I didn't do this because you're my mother," I said quietly. "I did it because you were the one person who made me believe I was unworthy of being seen, and I needed to prove to myself that I was never invisible." She wept. I sat there for a while silent. Then I left the room, and for the first time in decades, I didn't look back. I didn't visit her again that week, not because I was angry, but because I didn't trust what would happen if I stayed longer in that room. That sterile, humming silence. The way she looked at me like she finally saw something real. It was too late for that. I watched her recovery from the other side of the glass, her body slowly returning, her speech stabilizing. My device worked. The numbers didn't lie. But the more she healed, the more I felt something inside me fracture, because this wasn't healing for me. It was exposure. Every nurse, every technician, every passing hallway brought with it a memory I'd tried to store away. How she brushed my hair once when I had a fever at 5. How she locked the car door the day she dropped me off, drove away without a backward glance, the scent of her perfume lingering longer than her love, and now she wanted redemption. You don't get to rewrite the story after the credits roll, but still, I couldn't stop remembering. There was a moment when I was 15 still in that state-run care facility when one of the nurses called out during medication time, "Chastain room 204. And I remember thinking, that name doesn't feel like mine anymore. I stopped answering to it for months, signed papers with just S. Because what do you call yourself when the only person who named you decided you weren't worth keeping? I thought I'd buried that version of me. But she surfaced now. Not angry. Just tired. Tired of waiting for someone to apologize who never would. Tired of rehearsing forgiveness just to make someone else feel better. Linda sent a letter to my lab office. It was typed, 2 pages, clinical, measured, contrite in the way a politician might be when forced to face an old scandal. There were sentences like, "I was young, I didn't know how to be a mother to a child with special needs, and I thought I was protecting you from my own failures." And the last line? "If you're willing, I'd like to find a way back, to talk, to heal." I read it once. Then I folded it neatly and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk, right beneath the copy of my original medical transfer papers, the ones where she signed me over to the state. Same signature, same date, different kind of silence. I didn't respond, but the next morning I found myself back in the observation room, alone. She was sitting upright, combing her thinning hair slowly. There was a calm in her posture now. The desperation had faded, replaced by something quieter. Not peace. Not guilt. Just waiting. When the nurse stepped out, I rolled the door open. She looked up startled at first. I said nothing, just wheeled to the chair across from her and stopped. She waited. "You had 40 years, I said quietly. 40 years to wonder if I was okay." Her lips parted. I raised a hand. Not to silence her, just to finish. "You didn't check, not once." "I know. I searched every database. No inquiries, no contact logs, not even a postcard on my birthday." She looked down. "I didn't expect a mother, but I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd remember I existed." "I did," she said finally, voice almost a whisper. "I remembered every day." I nodded. That's the part that hurts most. There was no reply. No plea this time. No performance. Just the sound of the machine beeping steadily beside us. "I don't hate you," I said. "I thought I would. I used to imagine all the ways I'd confront you. I rehearsed entire conversations in my head, some angry, some noble. But now that you're here, it's not rage I feel." "What is it?" she asked, tears slipping down her cheeks. I met her gaze, steady, clarity. Because that's what this was now. Clear, clean, quiet. The part where I stopped needing anything from her. Not an apology, not love, not even her understanding. I stood to leave. She reached forward, slow, weak. Her fingers brushed my sleeve. "Sarah, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll ask anyway." I paused, then spoke with all the calmness I had left. "This isn't about what you deserve." And I turned toward the door. Before I left, I looked back just once. She was still there, still seated, her hand resting on her lap where mine had been. That was the last time I saw her in person. Some moments aren't made for closure. Some are made for letting go. I didn't answer the letter. I didn't block her either. I just kept moving. My team continued refining the interface, and I filed the final regulatory documents with the FDA 3 weeks later. We'd had a 93% success rate in early trials, and our clinical expansion was ahead of schedule. For the first time in years, the data wasn't just promising, it was undeniable. I should have been celebrating, but celebration isn't easy when your past is still echoing through your ribs. So instead, I worked. I buried myself in lab hours, test groups, back-end revisions. I stayed long after the interns left and often arrived before the security system reset. I wasn't chasing success. I was anchoring myself to something I could control, because forgiveness isn't always an act. Sometimes it's a boundary. A nurse on our team, Elena, once asked if I'd consider speaking publicly. "You're the lead inventor of the most promising neuro-recovery device in the country. People should see you." But I shook my head. Let the work speak, not the wounds. Still, I began documenting the full story, not for the press, not for pity, for the record. I started writing my own memoir at night, one paragraph at a time. Not a biography, not a revenge, a record, not of what they did, but of what I built anyway. And little by little, the act of naming my story gave me something I didn't realize I still needed: proof, not to the world but to myself, that I was never the absence. I was always the answer. Somewhere in that process, I received an invitation to keynote a medical conference in Zurich. Topic: silent innovation, the hidden voices behind biomedical breakthroughs. I hesitated. I'd never spoken on a stage before, not as Sarah Chen, not as the woman in the chair, but something about the title stuck. Hidden voices. That was me for years. I accepted, and I kept the speech simple. I didn't open with a quote. I didn't list my degrees. I just rolled onto the stage, looked out at the crowd of industry elites and bright-eyed researchers, and said I wasn't supposed to be here. There was a silence, not uncomfortable, just real. I continued. I wasn't invited to speak at science fairs. I wasn't photographed in family albums. I wasn't even listed on the hospital forms that first admitted me into long-term care. But that absence, that silence, it didn't stop me. It shaped me. I spoke for 12 minutes. No tears. No theatrics. Just data, clarity, and truth. After the conference, I received hundreds of emails from parents of disabled children, from women in STEM, from doctors who remembered seeing my name in journals but never knew the face behind the work. One email stood out. A girl named Mia, age 13, wrote, "I'm in a chair too. They say I should dream smaller. But after your talk, I think I'm going to study robotics." I printed that one, taped it above my desk, because that's why I kept going. Not for redemption, for impact. Meanwhile, Linda sent a second letter. Shorter, handwritten this time. It said, "I watched your Zurich speech. I'm proud. I hope that doesn't make it worse." I didn't reply. I didn't hate her anymore, but I also didn't owe her my healing. Instead, I did something unexpected. I launched a private research grant, named it the Quiet Signal Fund. No press release. Just an application link sent quietly to university disability centers, youth clinics, and under-resourced labs. The goal was simple: fund others like me, people who weren't chosen, but who chose themselves anyway. The first grant went to a young engineer in Detroit designing tactile response tools for stroke survivors. She had no degree, no pedigree, but her designs worked. She reminded me of someone I used to be. That month, I visited our test site in Oregon, one of the first hospitals to implement the full neurointerface system for post-trauma rehab. In the therapy wing, I met a man named Ron, Vietnam vet, 74 years old, couldn't move his right hand for over 2 decades. He sat there, tears running down his cheeks as he flexed each finger one by one. He looked up at me and whispered, "They told me I'd never feel my own hand again." I nodded. "Now you do." He didn't ask who I was, and I didn't tell him, because that moment wasn't about recognition, it was about resolution. When I left, the nurse on site thanked me. "For what you've built," she said. I smiled softly. "They never noticed what I was building," I replied, "and that's what made it possible." It happened on a Sunday. I was at the lab reviewing new diagnostic data when my assistant forwarded a press clip with the subject line, "You'll want to see this." It was a video, 2 minutes long. Linda seated in a wheelchair giving an interview from her rehabilitation center. The Chiron read, "Neural interface saved my life, a mother's redemption story." I watched without breathing. She looked smaller on camera, more human, but her voice still polished, still practiced. "I want to thank the brilliant inventor of the device that gave me back my life," she said. "Her name is Dr. Sarah Chen. She's also..." My daughter. My heart didn't stop. But it paused. She went on. We've had a complicated history. I made choices that caused pain. But I want the world to know that her strength, not just scientific but personal, restored more than my movement. It restored my faith. There were no tears, no real apology, just a public gesture. One that felt rehearsed, edited, packaged. By noon, the video had been picked up by 3 major news outlets. By evening, I was getting calls, emails, conference invitations. One reporter even asked, "Would you be open to doing a joint interview with your mother?" The public loves stories of reconciliation. I declined, quietly. But the machine had already started moving. The next morning, I arrived at the lab to find flowers on my desk. Cards, letters, congratulations from strangers, and among them, a note. No signature, just a typed line. "You saved her. You should let her say thank you." But I didn't need her thanks. I needed the truth to stay intact. Because the public didn't know that I'd spent my childhood in silence, that the woman they saw now soft-spoken and grateful had once arranged for my removal like a house renovation. What they saw was a redemption arc. What I carried was the full story. A few days later, I received an invitation from the National Medical Ethics Council. They wanted to honor me with an award for humanitarian application in neural technology. A black tie event, cameras, speeches. At first I hesitated. Then I said yes. But on one condition, I would speak last. That night I wore a black dress. Simple, no jewelry, hair tied back. As I waited backstage, I spotted Linda in the crowd, seated near the front. Elegant, reserved, a nurse by her side. She saw me. She nodded. I didn't return it. When they called my name, the applause was thunderous, blinding. I rolled onto the stage and positioned myself behind the podium. Then I paused, let the room fall quiet, and I began. Years ago, a woman told me I'd never amount to anything, that my condition made me less. I heard a murmur ripple through the room. I believed her. For too long. I took a breath, but belief is not truth, and silence is not peace. I clicked to the next slide, an image of the neural interface in its earliest prototype form. I built this technology because I knew what it felt like to be trapped, not just in a failing body, but in a story that wasn't mine. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. I ended simply. I didn't create this to be remembered. I created it because no one remembered me. Standing ovation. I left the stage without looking at Linda. Outside, the air was cool, sharp, real. I made it halfway down the steps before I heard her voice behind me. Sarah. I turned. She was standing, unsteady, but upright. She walked toward me slowly. "I shouldn't have gone public," she said. "I thought it was the only way I could say something you'd hear." "You could have just written the truth," I replied. She looked down, then reached into her purse. A folded envelope. "No cameras, no microphones," she said. "Just words." I didn't take it. Not yet. "You waited until the world loved me," I said softly, "to finally say you did too." Her eyes filled. I didn't know how to say it when no one else did. I nodded. "That's the difference between us." She looked at the envelope, then back at me. "Can I give this to you anyway?" I hesitated, then reached forward. Our hands didn't touch. She placed the envelope in my palm, stepped back, and said nothing else. I watched her return to her seat. She didn't look over her shoulder, and neither did I. Later that night, I sat by the window of my apartment. I didn't open the envelope. I just held it. Because closure isn't always about answers. Sometimes it's just knowing you don't need them anymore. I never opened the envelope. It stayed on my desk for weeks, tucked beneath lab reports, grant proposals, and clean pages of progress. Not because I was afraid of what was inside, but because I already knew. It would be too late and too careful, and I didn't need any more versions of almost love. Instead, I went back to work. The Quiet Signal Fund expanded to 4 countries. Our interface became standard care for neural damage in over 20 hospitals. People who hadn't walked in decades were standing, reaching, reclaiming. And through it all, I stayed quiet, not silent, just whole. One afternoon, I returned to the Oregon site where we first tested the prototype. A new wing had been built named after me. I hadn't approved the plaque, but I didn't remove it either. Inside the rehab room, a teenage boy was practicing grip control with a foam ball. His mother stood beside him, holding back tears. The boy looked at me curious. The mother smiled and said, "He doesn't know your name yet, but he knows what your work gave him." I nodded, heart steady. That's enough. Later that evening, back at my apartment, I lit a candle and pulled out an old folder I'd kept since childhood, frayed at the edges, filled with old clinic notes, scribbled coding ideas, and one photograph. It was the only photo I had from before the facility. I was maybe 6, sitting in a corner of the garden holding a picture book on my lap. Behind me, blurred in the background, was Linda. Back then, I used to stare at that photo hoping it meant something, hoping her presence behind me was proof of something unseen, affection, maybe, regret. But now I looked at it differently. She wasn't watching me. She was walking away. And yet there I was, still sitting, still reading, still learning, still becoming. It hit me then. I wasn't the absence. I was the persistence. The space between erasure and reinvention, the part of the story that refused to vanish. So, if there's a lesson in all this, maybe it's this: some people will leave, some will pretend you never existed, some will only look back when the world starts clapping for you, but your power isn't in their return, it's in your refusal to disappear. You don't need their apology to matter. You don't need their name to write your own. And if you're lucky, if you're brave someday, you'll look around at what you've built and realize that even if they never saw you, you always saw yourself.